Hey everyone, in this tutorial we're going to take a look at using the prop distribution tool to apply and arrange the props in your scenes in a variety of different ways, helping to make your scene creation and editing workflow more efficient. The prop distribution tool can be accessed from the Create menu, and it also has a dedicated toolbar that you can enable as well. To start, I'll demonstrate a couple of mesh placement options using these two simple plane meshes. Start off by clicking Pick Object, and then pick your mesh from the viewport or Scene Manager. An array of little blue markers will appear on the surface, and we can add the other plane mesh by simply clicking Add and then selecting it from the Scene Manager. Simply click Remove and then select the mesh you want to remove to exclude it from your placement area. In a more complex scenario where multiple meshes are intersecting, you may encounter some overlap like you see here, in which case you will need to remove the undesired intersecting meshes by using the Remove command. That's basic add-remove functionality. Now let's look at the random and formation generation types. Note that the target mesh must be visible in order to generate props on its surface. You can toggle this in the Scene Manager. In addition to picking objects from the viewport or Scene Manager, you can also import files from the prop distribution window. You can select multiple props in a single go using this method, which you can also do by clicking and dragging from the Content Manager. When you have your collection of props defined, you can proceed to hit Generate Placement for more randomly generated layouts, and then proceed to click on Deploy Props when you're satisfied. Each prop is assigned a ratio of 1 by default, which determines the likelihood that it will be placed. Naturally, a higher value here will increase the odds that prop will be used. You can determine the number of props in your array via the amount value. Note that Deploy Props must be clicked each time you want to update the values in your distribution, including the number of source props, which you can multi-select and remove. In addition to amount, there are a few other important parameters for randomized generation. Spacing determines the amount of space between your distributed props. However, keep in mind that this can be limited based on the amount of mesh space you've defined for generation. In addition, the spacing is calculated from the center of the marker, so if it's too close, you may have prop meshes that intersect. You'll also notice that each marker dummy has an arrow pointing to the direction of prop orientation, where the assigned front of the prop will face the same direction as the arrow. You can use the orientation value to rotate the orientation of all props in unison, or if you want a more randomized placement, you can use random orientation. You can also assign randomized scale values as well. Without Enable Scale Range checked, the props will all scale in unison. With it enabled, you can assign a range of values that will randomly be assigned to each prop. Let's take a look at formation distribution next. Here, I'll pick this plane as an assigned mesh and select the formation generation type. The default 3x3 marker layout will display. However, if I try to add another mesh to my distribution area, notice that random will be the only generation type option. To enable formation type again, you'll need to re-pick the mesh. If formation is chosen and you rotate your prop, the marker orientation will follow along with it. However, be aware that the X and Y offset values will follow the world axis. There are also options for the number of markers on each axis, in addition to the defined distance between them. If your distance value is too great and some of the markers are forced off the assigned mesh, they will show up as gray and won't generate any props. You can lock the X and Y distance values by enabling the Use X Distance as Y checkbox. Again, X and Y offset will follow the world axis as mentioned earlier. With formation type, orientation will rotate the entire marker group simultaneously with a pivot at the center of the array. Here, random orientation will assign each marker its own individual rotation value, but the formation will remain intact. Scale works the same as in random mode, with the ability to set a range as well. NavMeshes can be used to set a more complex distribution area for your props. For example, in this scenario we have a number of props everywhere on this work floor, and it would be rather time consuming to add individual props to all the empty spaces. An efficient fix for this is to start off by generating a NavMesh volume and resizing it to cover the entire area. You'll see that it will only generate between the props, as NavMeshes are meant to be defined areas for character movement. You can also tweak the various values to conform the NavMesh edges more closely to the props in the scene. For more on NavMesh generation, check out the dedicated tutorial. We can further remove areas of the NavMesh by going into our NavMesh parameters and using a barrier volume. Click Update to exclude the area covered by the barrier volume. Now you'll see that we can pick the NavMesh as an object in the prop distribution window. From there, we can tweak all of the previous values we went through to get the desired distribution setup. Okay, lastly let's look at generating props along a path, which is useful in a scenario like this, where I'm going to generate a series of trees. Note that the defined path area here is widened so as not to have a single line of trees. When I select it in my prop distribution window, you'll see the markers fill the defined area of the path. From there, I can once again set a number of tree props to use, and then randomly generate them along the path. In this next scenario, our path is a bit more narrow, and I'll use formation type here with a couple of fence props. Note that we now have a context-dependent checkbox here called Use Path Width. With this enabled, any markers not along the defined path area will become disabled. In the case of a fence like this, it's most likely that we'll only want to have a single line along our y-axis here, so the y amount will be set to only 1. There's also x and y distance values that we can tweak here according to the dimensions and orientations of the props in our formation. Be aware that extreme values here can cause mesh overlap. You can further tweak the positioning with the x and y offset values, as well as the ratio value that we mentioned earlier. It's important to note that in a scenario like this with a distribution of fence props, that the width of each prop in your source library be a consistent width. In this scenario, you can see the width values for each fence section are indicated in the name, with the door section only being 3.4 meters while the fence section is 6.4 meters. If this is the case, you'll have uneven formation distribution, as this generation type requires consistent values to calculate a flawless connection between the props. If we replace the fence section with a consistent width value, we'll get a perfect result. Lastly, prop distribution on a curved surface can create a unique challenge. In a scenario like this where we have a curved roof that I want to cover with leaves, you can use an unconventional method to determine where the leaves will be distributed. As we covered in the beginning, when selecting a source object for your distribution, intersecting meshes will also be included. However, when you remove them, it also removes the prop distribution markers. Keeping that in mind, I prepared a couple of podium-shaped props which can be found in the embedded library and combined them with some scaled cubes. Now when I select the hanger as the source object, the markers will be placed all over the multiple meshes as we saw previously. From there, we can remove them, then toggle their visibility off to get a more accurately defined area to distribute our leaves. From there, I can choose a number of leaf props, tweak some parameters, and then generate to get a pretty cool looking result. That's a couple of cool tips and tricks on how you can use the prop distribution tool in various ways to save time when setting up your scene. Thanks for watching everyone, and I'll see you in the next video.